Hello and welcome. It is Erick Erickson here, the Erick Erickson Show. Call in, be a part of the program if you like, 877-97-ERIC. That's 877-973-7425. Yours truly happens to be the news story this morning. Nationally, I was trending on Twitter nationally. A lot of people angry at me for what I had to say about the New York Times, but you need to know about the New York Times and what they're doing. It's actually big, and I guarantee you it's coming to a curriculum program near you. Pay attention. This is why you should homeschool kids if you can. I mean, the indoctrination is going fully here. You can find this piece. I've written about it at theresurgent.com. You can go to theresurgent.com, or you can text show to 33777 and you can get my daily email where I put all the links to the stuff I'm talking about. That's the word show. Text it to the number 33777. So the New York Times is essentially decided to embrace neo-Confederatism. What is neo-Confederatism? Well, neo-Confederate worldview. A neo-Confederate worldview essentially argues, and I know people who argue this, the New York Times argues that that essentially the South won. That the United States was founded on slavery. The South won the Civil War, and everything about this country is built around slavery. Slavery is infested in everything. Everything is built on slavery. It is a worldview that essentially adopts a neo-Confederate worldview to then try to rebut it and say, well, yeah, everything is bad. It's a dangerous game that the New York Times has played, and we get a sense of why they're doing it in an off-the-record conversation that the editor of the New York Times, Dean Paquette, had with staff. Essentially, the inmates are now running the asylum at the New York Times, and they've given way to it. And this idea of wokeness and a racism or anti-racism as a religion is really infesting the staff there and rotting their brains. So let me just say this at the outset. The New York Times should, and everyone should, cover slavery in America, particularly as we have gone on as a country and things have improved. We do forget just how bad things once were. We have a rosier picture, perhaps, than we should in some cases about the country. But at the same time, though slavery is the original sin of this country, it is indisputable that this country has lifted more people out of poverty and freed more people from tyranny than any other country on earth. The New York Times premise is that we're still a bad country, and that we will always be a bad country as long as we exist as we currently do, a capitalist society with certain institutions like the Senate that are not representative of the people as a whole and therefore are illegitimate because slavery is polluting everything. And the problem is the New York Times has to get basic facts wrong to make its case. Now, before I delve into what the New York Times itself is doing, you need to understand a larger picture here. And that is that this is a program going on, this wokeness idea going on across the country. California has decided that it needs to revamp its history classes for ethnic studies and ethnic diversity. And one of the things California wants to do is it wants to repackage American history through intersectionality. Now, intersectionality is this bizarre concept of people who have the most privilege need to be quiet, and the people who have the least privilege need to be listened to. So if you are a white Christian male, then your opinions are invalid and you need to shut up and sit off to the side and let the person who is a minority, gay, transgendered, disabled person who's from a Muslim background, they should reign supreme. It's this bizarre thing where if you were raised in a heterosexual two-parent stable household and your parents didn't get divorced and you were middle class, then somehow you're a bad person because you were privileged to live as opposed to others were not. This idea of privilege, we hear about it more and more and more. It becomes a way of saying that your existence, you are born a sinner because of your existence. It is a religious context to everything that is happening. It is a secular view of sin, this idea of privilege and intersectionality and determining who's a bigger sinner than others. It's all about the religion of wokeness that has infected everything, including the New York Times. So we as a country should have a better idea of slavery. We as a country should understand our history better. With the rise of so many people feeling comfortable with white nationalism, I think the country does need to understand where we came from. Unfortunately, the New York Times gets it all wrong. I mean, just for start, and again, you can go to theresurgent.com. I've got this. I actually printed it out instead of going there. Let me read you from myself, actually. There is real racism in the United States. It's objectively true that white supremacists have been emboldened these last few years, and it is objectively true President Trump's rhetoric has played a part even if he didn't intend it to. In my opinion, his rhetoric often plays a part because of how the media twists his words and mischaracterizes them. For example, his references to criminals crossing the border as rapists and criminals didn't apply to all Mexicans, but the media claimed it did. His reference to animals applied only to MS-13 murderers, but the media claimed it applied to all immigrants. And there are plenty of other examples. It's also objectively true that many of the president's critics behave in ways they claim only he behaves. And it is objectively true that there are plenty of people on the left who benefit by continually stoking racial tensions in the United States. It is objectively true that slavery was this nation's original sin. But it is also true that hundreds of thousands of people spilled their blood on the Union Army side as propitiation for that sin. Now, let me stop there for those of you who don't go to a deep theological church or don't go to church at all. The word propitiation essentially means the substitution for our sin. Christ's propitiation. He on the cross died for us. To forgive us of our sins. Essentially, what the left is doing is saying we're all sinners, we've never been forgiven, and they completely ignore the shedding of blood by the Union Army to free slaves. The New York Times wades into this with its 1619 Project. It's a worthwhile endeavor designed to educate Americans about slavery and the role it played in the New World. Unfortunately, the Times is ill-prepared to do justice, in part because it's handed over the project to a group of opinion writers who profit from stoking and fueling racial grievances. Now, let me give you some quotes from this. So here's where they start out with the 1619 Project. No aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that followed. On the 400th anniversary of this fateful moment, it is finally time to tell our story truthfully. Tell our story truthfully. So how does the New York Times begin to tell our story, the story of the United States, truthfully? How do they begin? Well, let me read you the very next paragraph. The project aims to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding, not 1776, not the Revolutionary period, but all the way back to 1619 as our true founding, and placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. Let me just unpack that for you. What the New York Times is admitting is it wants to rewrite American history, and it wants to do so by looking at everything from a racial lens. The problem is that not everything can be looked at from a racial lens, as we're about to see, but the New York Times wants to do so anyway. So it set 1619 as our true founding. The reason is because in August of 1619, the first slaves from Africa landed in Virginia in 1619. But there is a problem here. The problem is that there were already people here before slaves landed. There were already systems of government being set up before slaves landed. You wouldn't know that, really, from the New York Times. The House of Burgesses in Jamestown met in July, on July 30th, 1619. Before slaves made it to Virginia, the people, the colonists, the would-be future American citizens were already forming governments and were not contemplating slavery in the forms of their governments. And you would never know that from the New York Times, which suggests our entire system of government was founded around slavery, and yet the governments were existing before then. Or, for example, take this. The Mayflower Pilgrims landed in New England in 1620. There were no slaves there. They probably did not even have knowledge of what was happening in Jamestown. Certainly they knew of its existence, but as to what was going on a day-to-day basis, the existence of slavery there and how many slaves there were, we don't know. The history books would suggest they had no knowledge of it. By 1623, before slavery made it to New England, the Pilgrims with Plymouth plantation having nothing to do with slaves, mind you, it was a word used to describe the area, Pilgrim plantation, or Plymouth plantation. The Pilgrims had rejected communal property ownership in favor of a free market capitalist society built on private property ownership. William Bradford actually writes about this in his book on Plymouth Plantation, how when they first came in 1620, the Pilgrims organized their land in New England around a collective sharing arrangement where everyone would work and contribute to the whole. And guess what? It was a complete disaster. It was a disaster because some people did work and other people said, well, they're doing all the work. I don't have to do the work. I can go do something else. And a lot of people starved. A lot of people had problems. A lot of people didn't develop the land as fully as it could. So by 1623, before slavery came to New England, the Pilgrims had decided they needed to embrace Adam Smith and essentially embrace Adam Smith. Now, the concepts Adam Smith would write about, everyone was given private property. The family that was given the private property had the obligation to farm the land, to take care of it as stewards, based on the biblical concept out of Genesis 1 and 2 that we would be stewards of the land. They were given their own land to till. From that land, they would take care of their own family, and they could sell in the free market the leftover to those who their crops didn't turn out as well. And people could make money that way. Not only could people make money, but they had an incentive to take care of their land to feed their family and potentially make some money. It was a free market capitalist system. But you would not know that by reading from the New York Times, which in fact suggests that capitalism itself is based on slavery, which is not true. American capitalism is brutal. Let me read you this paragraph. Those searching for reasons the American economy is uniquely severe and unbridled have found answers in many places. Religion, politics, culture. But recently, historians have pointed persuasively to the natty fields of Georgia and Alabama, to the cotton houses and slave auction blocks as the birthplace of America's low road approach to capitalism. Now, what this author is pointing out is that other countries have embraced a level of socialism and unionization. The United States has rejected it because they've embraced what? What have we always called it? The Puritan work ethic that came from where? Not the, quote, natty fields of Georgia and Alabama, the cotton houses and slave auction blocks. No, but from New England, where the Pilgrims learned in order to feed and take care of themselves, they needed to have private property and free enterprise and leave each other alone and unregulated to be able to prosper. That's where it comes from. You would not know that from the New York Times. From the New York Times, they would completely rewrite history. Again, this goes back to the opening paragraphs of the 1619 Project. It aims to reframe the country's history. Reframe doesn't mean they're going to tell you the truth, the facts, or what happened. They're going to try to reshape and twist the facts to conform, and that's what they do. There's another bit of revisionism here. There's another essay on how essentially the politics of our current day are shaped by slavery and race. Republicans are racist bigots, and they're using the same things that the Southerners used to try to obstruct the movement and passage of time and block the abolition of slavery, etc. The debt limit standoff was a case study of a fundamental change within the Republican Party after Obama took office in 2009. Republicans would either win total victory or they would wreck the system itself. The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell used a variety of procedural tactics to effectively nullify the president's ability to nominate federal judges and fill vacancies in the executive branch. In the minority, he used the filibuster to an unprecedented degree. In the majority, after Republicans won the Senate in the 2010 midterm elections, he led an extraordinary blockade of the Supreme Court, stopping the Senate from even considering the president's nominee for the bench. Full stop. Full stop. Does anyone have any idea what is wrong with that paragraph that I just read? I mean, basic factual knowledge is at stake here. Basic factual knowledge the New York Times gets wrong. I'll give you the answer when we come back.
Want to be on the show? Call Eric now at 877-973-7425. That's 877-97-ERIC with a CK.
It is Erick Erickson, the Erick Erickson Show, here live with you this morning. The phone number, 877-97-ERIC. That's 877-973-7425. You can feel free to call in, although I have a confession to make. You can't call in yet. Probably in another 15 minutes you can call in. So my call screener is having to work remotely today and texted me at 6 o'clock this morning that at 4 a.m. a drunk driver took out a power transformer outside their neighborhood at a Chick-fil-A and took out the whole power to the whole area. So he's without power and unable to actually answer the call screening program this morning. They should have the power back on here shortly, according to Georgia Power. So if you're just tuning in, I'm talking about the New York Times 1619 project. They, in their words, say that their 1619 project aims to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding, and placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. And then they proceed to go on and rewrite the history of American capitalism to make it all about how mean and nasty it is because of slavery. And they go on to write about the battles of 2010 and the court backing and what the Republicans are doing to block Merrick Garland, except they get it all wrong. And again, let me read you this paragraph if you're just tuning in. This is written in the New York Times 1619 project. The debt limit standoff was a case study of a fundamental change within the Republican Party after Barack Obama took office in 2009. Republicans would either win total victory or they would wreck the system itself. The Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, used a variety of procedural tactics to effectively nullify the president's ability to nominate federal judges and fill vacancies in the executive branch. In the minority, he used the filibuster to an unprecedented degree. In the majority, after Republicans won the Senate in the 2010 midterm elections, he led an extraordinary blockade of the Supreme Court, stopping the Senate from even considering the president's nominees for the bench. That's just factually not true. And that is the extent to which the New York Times is more invested in reframing the narrative than actually telling the truth, which it claims it wants to do. The Republicans did not win the Senate after the 2010 midterm elections. The Senate Democrats maintained control until 2014. And in maintaining control until 2014, the Senate Democrats actually scrapped the filibuster. And in scrapping the filibuster, they made it impossible for Republicans to block circuit court nominees. And they began a Democratic effort to pack the courts. The only downside was that the Democrats dragged their feet on it, as did the Obama administration. They weren't nearly as successful as they could have been. But that's a Democratic problem. It's not a Republican problem. But what they're trying to do with this is they're trying to reshape history and claim that the Senate itself is illegitimate, that the Senate is anti-democratic. And the reason it's anti-democratic is because of slavery, which isn't true if you read the founding documents. Here's the danger with what the New York Times is doing. The New York Times is essentially saying that this country was founded in slavery and is illegitimate. And because this nation is illegitimate, its institutions are illegitimate. Because its institutions are illegitimate, the Constitution is illegitimate. Therefore, everything about this country is bad. And if everything about this country is bad, well, then it gives them permission to begin ignoring the institutions of the country. It gives them permission to ignore the Constitution. It gives them permission for revolution. The New York Times wants to light this fire. And once they light the fire, they're not going to be able to control it. But that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, it goes on through a series of essays. This is something they could have done well. But here's one of the most galling parts of this. They would have you believe that the country's still bad, the country's never moved on, and essentially they adopt this neo-Confederate worldview that the South really won. The South invaded every institution. Again, let me go back to their statement on how capitalism in the United States is brutal and terrible and totally misrepresent the history here. Those searching for reasons the American economy is uniquely severe and unbridled have found answers in many places: religion, politics, culture. But recently, historians have pointed persuasively, I wonder what historians, Howard Zinn maybe, to the natty fields of Georgia and Alabama, to the cotton houses and slave auction blocks, as the birthplace of America's low road approach to capitalism, and then goes on to praise all these socialist economies as being capitalist when they're not, and the United States being particularly brutal. You read that paragraph and you think, wait a second, Did the South actually win the Civil War? Is this a neo-Confederate worldview that they want to adopt the neo-Confederate worldview so then they can demagogue it and vilify it? That seems to be what the New York Times is doing here. They're trying to suggest that yes, everything about slavery infested the United States and everything is bad because the South won when the South didn't. And that's the galling thing here. They ignore the 500,000 American Union soldiers who died freeing the slaves. It is a complete rewriting of American history to nurse grievances and make people angry. It is Erick Erickson, the Erick Erickson Show. The phone number, 877-97-ERIC. That's 877-973-7425. You can also get me on social media at EW Erickson, EWERICKSON, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Now, I need to conclude with a little bit from the New York Times itself to explain why they're doing this. I don't want to spend the whole day on this 1619 project, but you need to know about it. It's getting a ton of buzz. And I guarantee you we're going to start seeing this try to crop up in curriculum around the country for local school districts. And the reason is because the left is really infatuated with the idea of using public schools for indoctrination. We're seeing this in California, where in California they've decided ethnic studies must take predominance over the way history is taught. They're reshaping things. In fact, one of the things that the California Board of Education wants kids to do is to take a privilege walk. A privilege walk essentially is where if you're white, take a step forward. If you're not white, take a step backwards. If your parents have never said, I love you, take a step backwards. If they've said, I love you, take a step forward. And eventually you separate the whole class, and the ones at the far end of the room, the ones with the most privilege, they're the ones who are sinful and should not be listened to. It's a way of shaming kids for having the benefit of being raised well, raised in a good household, raised in a stable family. We as a society, in fact, that's one of my underlying problems with this thing at the New York Times is that it completely ignores, doesn't want to touch the collapse of the two-parent nuclear household within the black community, in large part due to tinkering by Lyndon Johnson and progressives in the 1960s with the Great Society, and not just in black communities, but in white communities and poor white communities, telling families that you really don't need each other, you need Uncle Sam. And that transcended racial lines and has kept so many people in poverty, a dependence on government, a collapse of social services in local communities where everything is outsourced to Washington, D.C., a collapse of the need to be dependent on churches and other charitable interests in local communities. All of this plays together, and of course that's all ignored. But this is why they're doing it. You need to understand why the New York Times is doing the 1619 Project. So there was a closed-door meeting between the New York Times management and writers. You'll recall that there was a headline about Donald Trump's speech after El Paso. And the speech, the headline to the speech was very neutral. President calls to decrease tensions or some such. And people were livid that it did not attack the president. The headline was too neutral. People blasted the New York Times for it. They had to come out and apologize. They demoted the guy who did it, punished him for daring to be fair. And so they had this off-the-record discussion, and naturally a transcript leaked. Let me read to you from Dean Baquet. This is not edited. This is a whole passage, so you don't think I'm taking him out of context. The day Bob Mueller walked off that witness stand, two things happened. Our readers who want Donald Trump to go away suddenly thought, holy blankety blank, Bob Mueller is not going to do it. And Donald Trump got a little emboldened politically, I think, because, for obvious reasons. And I think that the story changed. A lot of the stuff we're talking about started to emerge like 6 or 7 weeks ago. We're a little tiny bit flat-footed. I mean, that's what happens when a story looks a certain way for 2 years, right? I think that we've got to change. I mean, the vision for coverage for the next 2 years is what I talked about earlier. How do we cover a guy who makes these kinds of remarks? How do we cover the world's reaction to him? How do we do that while continuing to cover his policies? How do we cover America that's become so divided by Donald Trump? How do we grapple with all the stuff you all are talking about? How do we write about race in a thoughtful way, something we haven't done in a large way in a long time? That, to me, is the vision for coverage. You all are going to have to help us shape that vision. But I think that's what we're going to have to do for the rest of the next 2 years. Do you understand what Dean Baquet is saying? That they all thought Bob Mueller was going to take out the president and he didn't, so now they've got to come out with a way to take out the president? That's essentially what he's saying right here. These are his own words. I'm not making up his words. These are his words from the transcript of the meeting. So Bob Mueller didn't take out the president of the United States, so the New York Times wants to. And the way they're going to do it is by sowing racial discord, racial division, amplifying racial tensions in this country to keep people inflamed with each other. That's what he's doing. You know, what's so crazy to me is that all the things the left accuses Donald Trump of doing, the left themselves does. It's very frustrating to see. It's very frustrating to know it. But that's the reality of what we're dealing with here. The New York Times is ceasing to be a paper of record and intends to be an organ of the Democratic Party. And in so doing, they intend to divide the country. They accuse the president of wanting to divide the country. Here comes the New York Times wanting to amplify racial tensions and divide up people along racial lines. They want to undermine the American experience and the American experiment and claim it's illegitimate. You know, the big difference between the Christian worldview and everything else, and it plays into the secular stuff. There's a famous story about C.S. Lewis. He walked in on a group of religious scholars who were trying to decide what's the major difference between all the religions, and they really couldn't come up with one. And they asked C.S. Lewis when he came in the room, and he said, oh, that's easy. Christianity has a concept of grace. Other religions don't. You see that with the secular religion that's taking foot, this woke religion that's taking foot in secular societies and secular life within the New York Times. 500,000 Union soldiers died, 350,000 of them through being shot and killed on the battlefield, another 200 some odd thousand through getting infectious disease or wounded and dying thereafter, getting sick. 500,000 people lost their lives to free slaves in this country. Everyone has to acknowledge slavery was the original sin in this country. But everyone should also acknowledge that we have actually improved lives. Everyone should also acknowledge that we still have a long way to go. But everyone should acknowledge that people in this country are far better off than other countries, and people in poverty here are well off compared to people in many other countries. And they don't want to do that. See, there's no concept of grace in wokeness. And as long as any other person is around who hasn't embraced wokeness, the woke people are still bad off. You got to silence and censor those who aren't woke. You got to shut them up. There's no concept of grace for him. I mean, listen to Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke went to Arkansas where he's campaigning. Beto O'Rourke has decided he's going to relaunch his campaign. It's going to be about gun violence and racism in the country. And I want to play this for you. This is an extended clip of Beto O'Rourke talking in Arkansas. Listen to this.
And this country, though we would like to think otherwise, was founded on racism.
This country was founded on racism, according to Beto O'Rourke.
Has persisted through racism.
It has persisted. Think about that. This is a guy running for president who believes the country was founded on racism and that racism persists today. By the way, racism is real. Racism does persist. Those of us on the right should not say it doesn't exist, but I also think that people on the left should not amplify it more than it actually is. People on the right tend to downplay it so much in large part because they so often get accused of racism when they're not and not doing racist things. People on the left tend to amplify it because, God forbid, anyone should look at Republicans and think, hey, maybe there's an idea there about how we should order our society along conservative principles. No, you can't do that. That's all racism. They've got to amplify it.
And is racist today. And if you don't want to accept that phrase or that word or that distinction, look at this. There's 10 times the wealth in white America today than there is in black America. There are 2.3 million people behind bars tonight while we enjoy our freedom, disproportionately comprised of people of color, the largest prison population on the planet, bar none. In a kindergarten classroom, 4 or 5-year-old child of color is 5 times as likely to be disciplined or suspended or expelled as a white child in front of the same teacher for the same infraction in the same country today. But this racism, though foundational, literally kidnapping people from West Africa, bringing them here to build the greatness of this country on their backs, and then denying their ancestors the meaningful opportunity to enjoy in the wealth that they had created.
This goes on. This is a guy running for president of the United States. Now, I do have one question here, and Beto, I think, opens the door to this question. Robert Francis O'Rourke, you're not really Beto. You adopted Beto so you could ingratiate yourself within a Hispanic community in El Paso, Texas, and run for office. You're Robert Francis. When you went up to the Ivy League, you didn't want to be called Beto. You wanted to be called Rob or Bob. but you're a white dude. You don't have any Hispanic in you. You're a white dude. You're named Robert Francis O'Rourke. You have multiple candidates of color running for president of the United States. If you really believe what you're saying, why are you running for president instead of supporting one of them? And the answer is because he doesn't really mean it. He's just trying to be woke. He thinks that going left and being woke is how he's going to win the presidency. He didn't talk about this on the campaign trail in Texas. He didn't say these things in Texas. He wanted to wrap himself in the Texas flag and the Alamo when he ran for the Senate in Texas against Ted Cruz. But now that he's running for president, suddenly it's all bad. It's all racist. It's all bad. And that's what we're getting from Democrats. This is why I think, listen, I have a great deal of skepticism about the president in 2020, largely because of the economy. But this is why I think the president has a leg up on some of these people, because I think they're overplaying their hand on this. The whole idea that the United States is still bad. And by the way, he's listing some statistics, and O'Rourke is not wrong in a lot of these statistics. Some of them he's exaggerated or made up, but a lot of them's right. The high incarceration rate in the black community, the high rate of suspensions in public schools among the minority community, particularly the black community. How much of that is because of racism, and how much of that is because of the collapse of the family? And how much of the collapse of the family is because of racism or because of the government trying to make things better and they screwed it all up? Because my sense is that when you actually track, and there's been plenty of sociological research, but you're not allowed to talk about this stuff. I mean, from mainstream economists and sociologists, that black families in this country were definitely improving along the way. Wealth was being accumulated within black families. And then sometime around the time of the Great Society, things went bonkers. Families broke down. Husbands and wives separated. Something happened. And there was a societal collapse within a lot of the black community. And you're starting to see the pieces being picked up and put back together. And marriage rates go back up in some areas of the country and wealth rise again. But you can't understate the collapse of the family. And this is one of my problems overarching all of this, is that in so focusing on racism and race, we are ignoring the collapse of the family that impacts all communities in this country, regardless of race. And study after study after study after study after study shows that the collapse of family has a meaningful impact on kids' education, kids' discipline, kids' future crime, kids' stability, wealth accumulation, the gap between the rich and the poor. All of this has to do with the family. It doesn't have to do with race. It has to do with family. And nobody wants to talk about the family, because if you have to talk about the family, well, then you're damning left-wing priorities. You are hurting left-wing principle and left-wing policy that has essentially said the family doesn't matter. That moms and dads are interchangeable. They don't necessarily matter. Uncle Sam's all that matters. Being able to attach yourselves to Uncle Sam's man boob is really what the government wants you to do. And when you do and the family collapses, well, guess what? Income discrepancies go up. The division between the rich and the poor goes up. Crime rates go up among broken families. Kids' attention spans are decreased in broken families. The drug use, the crime and broken families goes up. On and on it goes. All the statistics relate to a collapse of family. It's unfortunate. Beto O'Rourke was also on Meet the Press with Chuck Todd. Listen to some of this.
From the outset of this campaign, even before this campaign, I talked about how dangerous President Trump's open racism is. The Mexicans as rapists and criminals, the Muslims who should be banned from this country, how it doesn't just offend us, but it changes us. The rise in hate crimes, every single one of the last 3 years. The mosque in Victoria, Texas, burned to the ground the day after he signs his executive order attempting to ban Muslim travel. But it wasn't until someone inspired by Donald Trump drove more than 600 miles to my hometown and killed 22 people in my community with a weapon of war, an AK-47, that he had no business owning, that no American should own unless they are on a battlefield engaged with the enemy. It wasn't until that moment that I truly understood how critical this moment is and the real consequence and cost of Donald Trump.
It wasn't until that moment that he truly understood. Really? I mean, now suddenly you're woke and the light bulbs come on and, oh, we're a racist nation, and that's why you didn't talk about it 2 years ago. Again, why are you running for president? when there are multiple candidates of color who are running. Beto is desperate, and he's starting to embarrass himself, and that's kind of what we have to expect from the rest of his campaign, I guess. He is not going to be the nominee for the Democratic Party, and yet he won't get out. He won't run for Senate. How long before Democrats are really fed up with him?
I really do like his opinion on things.
Erick Erickson, the information you need and the truth you demand.
He tells it like it is.
Live every weekday.
It is Erick Erickson here. The phone number, 877-97-ERIC. That's ERICK. You can also dial, if you just don't want to do the numbers in your head, letter conversion, 877-973-7425. Although, wait for my call screener to get power back at the studio he's using. All right, I got one more Beto O'Rourke clip I need to play. Wow, I did not expect to spend the entire hour on this stuff. I have so much more I want to get to, including we've got audio of the president wanting to buy Greenland. But when we come back at the top of the hour, Stacey Abrams, yes, she was on ABC News this weekend. Never has a more unsuccessful candidate gotten more successful press coverage, except for maybe Beto O'Rourke. But listen, one more clip from Beto on Meet the Press.
No, because I'll tell you, if we don't deliver on universal, guaranteed, high-quality health care, on a minimum wage that's a living wage, on paid family leave, on those issues that restore dignity to the lives of our fellow Americans, then we have not only failed them, we have provided fertile ground for the kind of demagogue that Donald Trump is, who will channel that anger and frustration at our government's dysfunction and our inability to get something done against immigrants, as he's done, warning of invasions and infestations and animals and predators, having somebody at one of his rallies say we should shoot them. And the crowd roars their assent, and Donald Trump smiles because he doesn't want you to focus on the fact that you're working 2 or 3 jobs right now just to make ends meet, or that you live in the wealthiest country on the face of the planet, but you can't afford to take care of your diabetes. Yes, Democrats have to address those issues.
Wait. We need to stop that. So people started working 2 and 3 jobs under Barack Obama, and it was under Barack Obama that they started counting those as all one big job for employment terms. Obamacare happened under Obama, and the Republicans haven't gotten rid of it, but somehow these are all Donald Trump's fault, these failures of Barack Obama and the Democrats?
And deliver on those issues. But we also have to call out the existential threat, to use the word that you just employed, that Donald Trump represents right now. Not only are we going to lose more lives, I'm confident that we will lose this country and our democracy the longer he stays in office. So
we will lose our country and our democracy. You know what? No, we won't. This is kind of like Republicans who all the time say that this is the most important election of our lifetime. If we don't win this, America is unrecoverable. Republicans say this all the time. It hadn't happened. Democrats now say it. You know, I'm old enough to remember back in 2000, after George W. Bush won, Republicans were absolutely convinced that Bill Clinton would not leave the White House. Because of the way the 2000 election went, George W. Bush lost the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College, barely. You had the messy recount in Florida. You had Republicans, some of whom were friends of mine, in college, were standing outside the Naval Observatory, chanting, yelling loudly to get out of Dick Cheney's house before January 20th. Republicans became convinced that Bill Clinton was not going to vacate the White House. If you'll recall, in the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, Democrats became convinced that George W. Bush would not leave the White House, that Dick Cheney would insist, that tricky Dick Cheney, the dark master, would convince George Bush not to vacate the White House. And he did. In 2017, Republicans became convinced that Democrats would not leave the White House, that Barack Obama would not go quietly, that he would not surrender power. And now it's Democrats' turn, that somehow our democracy is at stake, that, you know, folks, I realize the New York Times wants to downplay it in their 1619 project, but we went through a civil war in this country. On the Union side, 500,000 Union soldiers died. Either 375,000 of them killed on the battlefield, another 200,000 died from getting shot and picking up infectious diseases. 500,000 combined Union and Confederate American soldiers, and yes, American soldiers all around. It took until only a few years ago for the body count in all wars combined that the United States has fought in to equal the amount of death American soldiers saw in the Civil War. Our president was assassinated. We've had multiple presidents assassinated. And it's okay. We got through that. We will get through this. We will continue. We will prosper. Our democracy will be fine. The problem is you've got all these people so convinced and telling everyone so frequently that our democracy is not fine, that our democracy is going to be undermined, that our democracy is going to collapse. On and on it goes. That at some point you're going to have people really begin to lose confidence in our democracy. It's the same way. You've got people out there right now saying economists complaining about the economy are going to help trigger the recession. Because they're talking it down so much, people are going to get skittish about investing. Same thing, you keep talking down our democracy, saying we're headed towards authoritarianism, you're going to see bad things happen because you willed it to happen. If rhetoric it causes people to do bad things, well, then bad things will happen from this rhetoric too. Hello and welcome. It is Erick Erickson here in the Erick Erickson Show. If you want to be a part of the program, 877-97-ERIC. That's 877-973-7425. Yes, my name, it has a K in it, E-R-I-C-K, which means you can also get me on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the like, at E.W. Erickson. I'm on YouTube. I'm actually live streaming on YouTube and Twitter today. Normally do Facebook Live, giving out YouTube and Twitter a little play. Stacey Abrams, she really wants to be governor of Georgia. And she really is bitter about losing governor of Georgia. She's really, really upset about it. She went to Gwinnett County outside of Atlanta and launched her new voting rights project. Absolutely convinced. She's selling the idea that people of color in this country, minorities, black voters in particular, but also Hispanic, are routinely and systematically purged from the voter rolls and intimidated into not voting. She was okay with the new Black Panthers standing outside polling places, and she's okay giving illegal aliens the right to vote, but she thinks people are being denied the right to vote systematically. Never, ever. So I've been doing politics since college in the mid-90s. I'm struggling to find a candidate who has been less successful and gotten more successful press coverage than Stacey Abrams. I mean, she really has. She should be paying double to her PR agency, whatever she's paid. I want to play for you the ABC News coverage this week, the Sunday show. George Stephanopoulos, Martha Raddatz was in for George Stephanopoulos. I want to play for you the opening. Just listen to how they frame Stacey Abrams with their coverage.
I acknowledge that former Secretary of State Brian Kemp will be certified as the victor in the 2018 gubernatorial election. But to watch an elected official who claims to represent the people in the state baldly pin his hopes for election on the suppression of the people's democratic right to vote has been truly appalling. So let's be clear. This is not a speech of concession.
That was Georgia's Stacey Abrams last November at the end of her bid to become the first African-American female governor in the U.S., mincing no words that she believed voter suppression gave the election to her opponent. Now, after months of speculation about her political future and whether she would join the crowded 2020 presidential field, Abrams this week launched her new initiative, Fair Fight 2020, focused on taking on what she calls voter suppression in the upcoming election. ABC's Lindsay Davis traveled to Atlanta to discuss Abrams' efforts.
So a losing candidate for governor, who was a state representative in the state house for a short time, is somehow this big deal. Now, let me explain to you why Stacey Abrams is a big deal to so many in the media. And some of you are not going to like what I have to say, but it's the truth. White liberal guilt. That's why Abrams is such a big deal to the media right now. Because it turns out, after the election was said and done, Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum in Florida had a better shot of beating their Republican opponents than Beto O'Rourke did in Texas. But the media went all in for Beto O'Rourke in Texas against Ted Cruz, and they ignored the two black candidates who had really good shots at winning historic victories in Georgia and Florida. And now they got to overcompensate and make up for it. And the way they're making up for it with Stacey Abrams is it plays perfectly into their narrative that Donald Trump is bad, Republicans are racist, and people of color are systematically discriminated against at the polling places. And so they're amplifying it. Well, they're giving Abrams latitude to say a lot of things. And listen to some of the stuff that Abrams says, like this on voting.
Do you believe that elections are essentially rigged?
What I mean by rigged is this. We have a right to vote in the United States that is afforded to eligible American citizens. But we have seen over the last 20 years a constriction on who has the right to use that right. We have seen it through voter ID laws. You can't get on the rolls, and if you get on the rolls, you can't stay. You may not be able to cast your ballot because they close your precinct or they change the rules. That's rigging the game.
Now, wait. This is important for people to understand who aren't listening in Georgia and may not know this. And for those of you who are in Georgia and have forgotten it or don't know it, The rules she's talking about, these are laws put in place by Democrats, not Democrats who then became Republicans. I mean, this is kind of the mythology of the Democrats right now, is that all these Democrats, they became Republicans. No, actually, these are Democrats, some of whom are still in the state legislature and supported these laws. Some of them are partisan Democrats in the Georgia legislature who supported these laws. Laws to clean up the rolls, laws to clean up the books. You know, after the Help America Vote Act, after the 2000 election, one of the things states were required to do was to make sure that their rolls were good, make sure that they had an accurate list of people who were eligible to vote. And laws were passed across the board in multiple states. This was a bipartisan measure in Congress that many of the Democrats now assailing these efforts actually supported at the time. And Abrams now says somehow this is bad. It's bad to see who can actually vote. Photo ID is bad to make sure the people voting are actually the people they claim to be.
Voter suppression is more insidious now in 2019 than it was even in the 60s. How so?
We have always struggled with voter suppression.
Wait. Did y'all hear that? She actually thinks that voter suppression and fraud and problems now are worse than it was in the 1960s?
You've suggested that voter suppression is more insidious now in 2019 than it was even in the 60s. How so?
We have always struggled with voter suppression. But what's happened in the last 20 years is that it's gone underground. It's no longer hoses and laws that say you cannot vote. It is this insidious nature that says it's race neutral, that we're just putting in these laws in place for everyone.
But we are. I mean, we are. Who can't vote? People can't vote, or dead people can't vote. People who've moved can't vote. People who've committed crimes can't vote. And people who've been declared insane can't vote. And that's what these laws do. They take those people off the rolls.
We know that it has a disproportionate effect on the communities that have long been marginalized.
Really? Really? Did you know that in Georgia, minority voting registration outpaced white voting registration in Georgia in 2016 and 2018? More black voters as a percent voted than white voters. Not as a percent of total population, but within their communities, you had way more whites, way more black voters as a percentage of the black community voted than white voters as a percentage of the white community. Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State. All of this systemic racism and shutting voters out, you actually had a historic number of black voter registrations and turnout in 2018 in Georgia.
This presidential election, there was a decrease in black voters for the first time in 2 decades.
But not in Georgia. Not in Georgia. See, this is how the media is trying to fool us here. That's not actually true in Georgia. In Georgia, you saw a spike in minority voter registration and minority voter participation in Georgia. I mean, Stacey Abrams herself only a few weeks ago was talking about how many black voters voted in Georgia. Record numbers.
Our initiative, obviously, is to make sure people can vote. How do you make sure they show up at the polls?
In America, we can choose to vote or not vote. Good candidates give you a reason to vote, but good government makes certain you can cast that vote. And
notice how she's having to dodge the issue here about minority voters. The reporter suggesting minority voters didn't show up at the same rate. Good candidates versus bad candidates. Yes. To the extent that minority voters didn't show up around the country in 2018, a lot of it had to do with they didn't like the candidates. Barack Obama wasn't on the ballot.
I take exception to is that we do not have people in government who are living up to their obligations. In fact, they are thwarting the will of the people by denying them access, and that's just wrong.
How are they denying? See, she can't actually explain. How are they denying people access to the vote? By requiring that the rules be followed, that everybody follows the rules, and that they get rid of the people on the polls who are in jail and can't vote, who are dead and can't vote, who have moved out of state or to a different community and can't vote, and people who've been declared mentally incompetent. The rewriting of this, the mythology of this, you notice she's no longer really engaging in the idea that she somehow lost. I mean, I played you the audio the other day. Let's see. Do I still have the audio clip here of Stacey the other day? Yeah, here we go.
We know that we also face foreign influence that is being denied by the White House, by the would-be tin pot dictator of Donald Trump, but also that Moscow Mitch is stopping voter rights legislation and election security legislation.
It's like she got the memo. She's got to say those sorts of things.
But we also know that they just lifted a consent decree that's kept Republicans and the RNC from going into local communities and intimidating voters by having off-duty officers.
That's right. It's going to be voter intimidation now with Stacey Abrams. Voter intimidation. That's the ticket. Wait, let's see. Is this the clip I was looking for?
Stacey Abrams ran for governor of Georgia that same year and lost by less than 55,000 votes. She believes that voter suppression and other tactics were at least partially to blame.
Do you think the vote was stolen from you? The election was stolen from you?
I think the election was stolen from the people of Georgia. I don't know that empirically I would have won.
I don't know empirically I would have won. She's had to back off of it. By the way, so I've had clips of Stacey Abrams the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, and now the 19th, 4 days in a row on this show. There have been audio clips of Stacey Abrams because she's on a press tour about this voting rights group. And the reason she's on a press tour about the voting rights groups is she needs guilty white liberals to send her money. That's what it is. And one of the things she has to say, in addition to calling Mitch McConnell Moscow Mitch to make sure everybody knows she's down with the lingo, she's got to say stuff like this, which she said to ABC News.
Would you say that President Trump is a white supremacist or a racist?
I have said many times he's a racist. But more importantly, he does not value Americans, and he does not value humanity. And that should be more disturbing to everyone than the title that we prescribe to him.
So let's fast forward 5 years. What position would you like to have?
One that helps me do the work of ensuring that poverty is coming to its end, that people have access to the right to vote, that communities are vibrant and thriving. I want to stand in office and do the work it takes to make sure that we have a fair fight in our elections, that we have a fair count about who's here, but most importantly, that everyone has the freedom and the opportunity to thrive.
This sounds like someone who wants to run for governor again. So it's important for Republicans to understand what Stacey Abrams has done. She's a very smart woman. Do not underestimate Stacey Abrams. I interviewed every single person running for governor in Georgia in 2018. I interviewed all the Democrats. I interviewed all the Republicans, and she was one of the best interviews. She is very smart. She is very self-deprecating. And Stacey Abrams knows what she wants. She wants to run for governor. One of the things that Stacey Abrams did in Georgia in 2018, for those of you who aren't in the state, you were only looking at national politics, you didn't have a good eye in Georgia what was happening. One of the issues that she raised was voters who were listed as pending voters. They couldn't come off the pending voter file. In Georgia, you fill out your application. You become a pending voter until your application is approved. One of the things they have to do is verify that you're 18 or older. If you're not, you can register in Georgia before you're 18, but you're a pending voter until you turn 18. Then you become an active voter. One of the other things that they do is they have to verify you're actually a citizen of the state of Georgia. And they check a federal database based on your social security number and your address. And Stacey Abrams claims that the exact match law, that everything had to exactly match, that kept all these people off, which wasn't true. In fact, one of the people they highlighted as running afoul of exact match actually was already registered to vote, which is why her second voter registration couldn't come through. But one of the other things is that the Secretary of State's office showed that between 11 and 13,000 of those 20 to 30,000 pending voters were pending voters because Stacey Abrams' voting rights group had registered them and screwed up the information. And the Secretary of State's office had reached out to voters to tell them to fix their voter registration form because an address was messed up or their social security number was wrong. And they never did. They never have. They're still pending voters. Because the Abrams voter registration team, they screwed those up. Those people might not even have existed. We have no idea. And essentially what happened is in 2014 and 2016, the Abrams Voting Rights Group manufactured a landmine that they could cause Brian Kemp to trigger in 2018 and use it against him and say, look, he's kept all these people as pending voters. We don't even know if the people are real. And I can guarantee you they're going to do the same thing this time. They're going to manufacture a lot of issues and then spring them in 2022 when they run again and say, oh, look what Brian Kemp did this time, when it was actually clerical errors on their part that they knew or should have known that they take advantage of. They weaponize their own mistakes against the Republicans. That's what's going to happen. It's what happened in 2018. Whether you think they did it intentionally or not, ahead of time, that's what happened. And it's going to happen again. We need to be prepared for it. But just before I go to break, let me just say again, it is mind-blowing to me that a candidate who lost, who was only a state representative, is suddenly this national rallying cry for the media. The only way that happens is if the good white liberals from New York and Washington in the media feel guilty because they focused on Beto O'Rourke, the second coming of the Kennedys. He's so Kennedy-esque. They focused on him against Ted Cruz, and they ignored candidates who were more viable, who happened to also be black, whose elections would have been historic. But the media didn't care about them because they were, yet again, the liberals in the media in love with the white guy in Texas running against Ted Cruz, and now they got to make it up to her. She's leveraging that guilt for her success. Good for her. I don't fault her at all. That's a smart move on her part. It's just amazing to see the media doing it.
Politics, news, religion. Erick Erickson talks about all the things you're not supposed to talk about every weekday. And some cooking, too.
It is Erick Erickson here. The phone number 877-973-7425. you can call in, except you can't because we're still dealing with the phone issue this morning. Oh, so I got up at 6 this morning, as I now do. The routine of the show has been good for me because when I was just doing an evening radio show, I could sleep in and not even shower until the afternoon. And now I get up at 6, I take a shower, I have my coffee, I start doing my work, and my poor producer called and said, we don't have any power, I don't have any internet, I don't have any phones, I can't do anything. So I got up this morning and I cut my own audio, I did my show prep and outlined my show, and we're good to go. And I got a ton of stuff because I didn't even expect to spend as much time as I did on all the other stuff. One thing I do want to highlight, I told you. This is my I told you so moment. The president, I told you he liked the way that line about guns and mental health resonated so much at his rally in New Hampshire. He's using it. Here's the president talking to the press yesterday.
So Congress is working on that. They have bipartisan committees working on background checks and various other things, and we'll see. I don't want people to forget that this is a mental health problem. I don't want them to forget that because it is. It's a mental health problem. And as I say, and I said the other night in New Hampshire, we had an incredible evening. I said, it's the people that pull the trigger. It's not the gun that pulls the trigger. So we have a very, very big mental health problem. And Congress is working on various things, and I'll be looking at it. We're very much involved.
Yeah, he likes that line a lot. And so we're going to hear way more of that. By the way, a lot of the Democratic candidates were in Georgia over the weekend. They were speaking at a youth conference that was organized by a number of churches in the Atlanta area. I got to tell you, this is another one of those examples, I think, of media bias that had it been Republican candidates talking to a Christian group, the media would be up in arms about the separation of church and state and the relationship of evangelicals with the Republicans and how corrupted it is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here we have Democratic candidates speaking to a Christian organizations conference in Atlanta. Bernie Sanders actually tried to use scripture to justify bigger, more expansive government and socialism. He actually did do that. I did not have time to wade through all of his ramblings to get you the audio, but I assure you, you can look it up for yourself. It is out there. Go to the freebeacon.com if you want. And he tried to use scripture to justify bigger, more socialist government to this Christian group. Can you imagine if a Republican stood on stage and tried to use scripture to justify the free market and capitalism? Can you imagine? We don't actually even have to imagine because Rush Limbaugh, good friend Rush Limbaugh, has in the past talked about in Genesis and Joseph and his brothers and how that essentially makes the case for the free market and the media ate him alive. How dare he use sacred scripture to justify the free market? And we see this with politicians as well. You have Marco Rubio, who routinely quotes scripture in Twitter, getting attacked by the media for his scripture. And yet here come these reporters to this conference to cover these Democrats, talking to a Christian organization, quoting scripture to justify their policies, and the media is completely quiet. In Atlanta this weekend, they did this. It's just, it never ceases to amaze me, these media double standards. You know, a friend of mine said you could be very successful in life as a conservative pundit if you just focused on media double standards. And I really do believe that he's right. Because there are so many double standards out there now. There are so many double standards by the media and in how they cover Democrats and Republicans, and we're seeing them. Now, when we come back, some more double standards, but we really need to get into the president, the tariffs, and what he's saying about dealing with China. There's a real big... The president has come out forcefully now about the Hong Kong situation and what he wants to do with Hong Kong. Also, red light cameras. Can we talk about red light cameras? It is Erick Erickson here, the Erick Erickson Show. The phone number, 877-97-ERIC, 877-973-7425. This hour of the show is brought to you by First Liberty Building and Loan, their website, firstlibertyga.com. My buddy Brant Frost owns and runs First Liberty, Georgia, with his family, good Christian man and family. If you are tired of dealing with banks, you want to grow your small, medium-sized business, you need access to capital, you don't want to deal with banks, go to First Liberty Building and Loan. Reach out to my buddy Brant Frost. Tell him I sent you. Go to firstlibertyga.com. You're helping me get the show off the ground. You're helping the show, letting them know that I sent you, and you're helping yourself and your business. firstlibertyga.com. Talk to my buddy Brant Frost. He can help you out if your business needs access to capital, need a loan, don't want to deal with banks, need a small family lender. They're your people. I'll get into the president. We got some of the president on Greenland as well. He's admitting they've talked about it, and he wants to talk to Denmark about it. But can I just talk about, where's the story? Red light cameras. I had the story somewhere. I don't necessarily, well, yeah, you know what? Let me find, yes, here it is right here. I hate red light cameras. And, I don't run red lights. I've never gotten a ticket. I've been through plenty of these, but I'm morally opposed to red light cameras. Let me read you this. This is from Joe Barnett, the editor of Budget and Tax News. Speed and red light cameras are the bane of many motorists, a modern idea made possible by technology. They've been installed in 24 states, including here in Georgia. Although these cameras are a revenue boon for governments across the nation, their intrusion into daily life is disturbing and their constitutionality dubious. Specifically, use of these cameras could violate the Sixth Amendment. The Confrontation Clause grants criminal defendants the right to be confronted with the witnesses against them. Since it is a camera and not a person that witnesses the offense, such violations generally cannot be considered a criminal offense. The ticket is issued to the owner of the vehicle, not the person driving it, leaving a lack of certainty as to the identity of the offender. Therefore, the ticket in most places is nothing more than a civil fine, making enforcement and collection difficult. To date, governments have avoided this problem by requiring payment of the fine before motorists can renew their driver's license or auto registration. Although there generally are appeals procedures, they typically do not give drivers a day in court. In other words, what happens to being innocent until proven guilty? There are several for-profit companies that install and operate the cameras, some of them foreign-owned. In a typical arrangement, a camera company will contract with local government to pay the capital costs of installing the cameras in exchange for a share of the revenue. Governments get new revenue without any operating costs. The camera companies make a profit. The companies and government officials argue greater safety will result in fewer accidents. Studies to confirm these claims have yielded mixed results. Studies paid for by the camera companies or government usually show fewer accidents. Independent studies and those financed by opponents usually show no gains and sometimes worse results. That's right, the independent studies. Here is one that the independent studies have shown. There's evidence that greater public safety actually depends on the timing of yellow and red lights. Longer yellow and all-way red lights or red times have been shown to reduce accidents. Sometimes local governments decrease yellow light timing to catch more red light runners, a result of the perverse financial incentives that tempt government officials and cameras. Studies also show motorists are more likely to hit brakes at camera-enforced intersections, increasing rear-end collisions. Yes. So here's the thing. I'm morally opposed because of the constitutional issue. So this is a tax on poor people, because a rich person is going to have more means to fight these things. Red light cameras, independent studies, not studies funded by opponents, not studies funded by the red light traffic camera companies, but independent studies that were curious have shown that many local governments reduce the time of a yellow light once they install the cameras so that they can catch more people running red lights and they can boost their ticket revenue. You also have an increase in slamming on brakes at intersections, causing rear-end collisions with these things, and governments are using them for revenue. Remember, the purpose of the traffic laws in Georgia is not for revenue increase, it is for safety. And it is very, very clear from the conversations of city councils that look at these things and the way they're pitched to city councils is not as a safety measure, but as a revenue generator. And that is why I think they're wrong. I think it's also wrong morally and constitutionally for the reasons in the article that how do they know it was you driving? And what in some states they do, and in Georgia they do, is if you say it wasn't you, they demand that you identify the person who it was. Well, you got spousal protection in Georgia and elsewhere, so you really can't turn in your spouse, but they'll want you to try. And then is it civil or criminal? Because you're innocent until proven guilty, and yet you're guilty until proven innocent with red light cameras. And, it's even worse in other places. In Washington, D.C. now, they have speed cameras. They want to put those in Georgia, by the way. You should understand this, that the Speaker of the House, David Ralston, his son, my understanding, has been a lobbyist for these things. Thus far, haven't been able to get them through the legislature, but speed cameras. So that if you're speeding, it is a camera that detects you, reads your license plate, and sends you a ticket for speeding. That's coming next in Georgia. That's why we should oppose red light cameras in Georgia. They are just awful, absolutely awful. We should be absolutely opposed to red light cameras in Georgia. You should tell your legislator in Georgia to oppose them. You should tell your legislator in Georgia to pass legislation to ban them. I don't care that city. I mean, Alpharetta, north of Atlanta, in North Fulton County is one of the places that uses red light cameras. I don't care that you're a state representative or a state senator from that area. You should be opposed to red light cameras, and you should be opposed to speed detection cameras. And yet people aren't. Okay, I honestly I could talk about this all day. I don't want to bore you, but it makes me enraged that local governments and our state government look at us as vehicles for revenue. Their job is to be our representatives, and instead they're looking for ways to grow government. And one of the ways they're doing it is doing things like this that taxes poor people. And the reason I say it taxes poor people is because a poor person is less likely to have the resources to fight a ticket generated by a red light camera than a rich person who can go to their lawyer or themselves have the wherewithal to write a letter and say, it wasn't me. I don't know why you're giving me this ticket. It wasn't me. And a poor person is not going to do that. They're not going to have the time to do it. They got to work. They can't take time another day. It's a tax on poor people, and they're bad. We should be opposed to them. Now, let's get to Greenland. The President of the United States had this to say to reporters about Greenland.
Well, Greenland, I don't know, it got released somehow. It's just something we talked about. Denmark essentially owns it. We're very good allies with Denmark. We protect Denmark like we protect large portions of the world. So the concept came up, and I said certainly strategically it's interesting, and we'd be interested, but we'll talk to them a little bit. It's not number one on the burner, I can tell you that. Well, a lot of things could be done. I mean, essentially, it's a large real estate deal. A lot of things could be done. It's hurting Denmark very badly because they're losing almost $700 million a year carrying it. So they carry it at a great loss. And strategically for the United States, it would be nice. And we're a big ally of Denmark, and we help Denmark, and we protect Denmark, and we will. In fact, I'm supposed to stop. I'm thinking about going there. I'm not definitely going there, but I may be going. We're going to Poland, and then we may be going to Denmark. Not for this reason at all, but we're looking at it. It's not number one on the burner.
Yeah. So he's thinking about Greenland. It's not number one on the burner, but he's thinking about Greenland. Well, one of the how do I want to put this? Maybe I do want to be somewhat diplomatic here. I spent the first hour, if you only tuned in the second hour, I spent the first hour talking about the New York Times' 1619 Project and how it's trying to rewrite American history through the lens of race and racism, that everything about this country is racist and built on slavery and it's all bad. And there's been no forgiveness, no recognition of the Union soldiers who lost their lives. And we are seeing a rise, I think, in white supremacist rhetoric in this country in the last few years. Suddenly, white supremacists mobilized in chat rooms across the internet feel like that they have a significant voice and they can come forward and start talking when they need to go back into the shadows and not be seen again. But what's also happening is a lot of people who really hate Americans who aren't Democrats, who really hate Christians, who really hate people in flyover country, blue-collar, hardworking workers. You got a lot of people in the media who really hate them. They don't relate to them. They're scared of them. They're the other. And people in the media typically live in bubbles in New York and Washington. They live along the coast. You know, in fact, let me tell you a story real quick. When I was looking at Fox News, so I was at CNN for 3 years and Fox at 5. And when I first went to CNN, Sean Hannity insisted I go meet with Bill Shine at Fox, who was the executive vice president at the time, Roger Ailes' right-hand guy. And I went in, and I'll never forget, Bill Shine took a map of the United States out of his desk. And he drew 2 circles around the East Coast and the West Coast, and he drew a little circle in the Durham area of North Carolina. And he said, here's why Fox is number 1. CNN and MSNBC fight over people who live within 50 miles of the coast. And MSNBC, pointing to the Durham Circle, has college towns, so they're ahead of CNN. Fox has everything else. CNN and MSNBC pay attention to what people are interested in within 50 miles of a coast. And Fox pays attention to what people are interested in with 100 miles of an American river valley. So Fox has more people. They cater to that audience. It's not that they are conservative per se. It's that they spend a lot of time in research trying to figure out what people in the heartland are interested in. And it's true. And what we see in the media is this just dripping contempt for people who live in the heartland. We see a dripping contempt for the people who live within 100 miles of an American river valley if they're not also within 50 miles of a coast. So you look at the Hudson River Valley, well, it's 50 miles of the coast. They're okay. A bunch of liberals live in there. They all relate. They all think alike. Rarely do they encounter someone who thinks differently. If you live in the heartland, your conservative neighbor could be right next to a progressive, who could be right next to someone who's more progressive, who right next to someone who's super conservative. And you all try to get along for your neighborhood, for your good. You don't talk politics. You find common ground. And you don't have to do that if you're on the coast in the media. You certainly don't have to do that if you're on MSNBC. Tiffany Green, I don't know who Tiffany Green is, but she's a commentator on MSNBC. She was talking about this Greenland thing. Listen to her dripping with contempt for people who support the president.
I'm a little concerned when I hear a descendant of colonizers talk about taking land from indigenous people. Like the Inuit people have been there for centuries, and we're very flimsily talking about taking their autonomous land. And I don't know if you remember in May 2018, Donald Trump talked about, white settlers who came here and tamed.
White settlers. No, he talked about people coming here and colonizing. He wasn't talking about white people, but that's how she heard it.
A continent. So we kind of know how he feels and views this space. So I think that's of concern, particularly for the people there. And I wonder, this is something, his supporters are like just blind followers of his. And I just wonder when this becomes a talking point of his on the campaign trail, can anybody at the MAGA rally point out Greenland on a map? I would be very interested and curious to see, or tell us what kind of government Greenland is, or who the indigenous people are. I highly doubt it. So I think when you have such a lack of understanding of global diplomacy, you can easily throw out these asinine ideas and have, the sheep following the wolf.
Have the sheep following the wolf, a group of people at a Trump rally. They probably don't know who lives in Greenland. They don't know how Greenland is governed. They probably don't even know where Greenland is on the map. They're all just a bunch of hicks and rubes. They're all stupid. This is a commentator on MSNBC, and no pushback, by the way, from the anchor. You get this sort of commentary dripping with condescension towards Trump's voters all the time from people in the media. And that is one of the reasons there is so much division. You now have this presumption. I mean, you had Pete Buttigieg on, by the way, I got to tell you, as an aside on Buttigieg. So when I first used Siri to try to dictate Pete Buttigieg's name in a tweet, it translated it as Butter Judge. Well, I typed it the other day, and the spell checker changed Buttigieg to Butt Tigress. So Pete Butter Judge Butt Tigress Buttigieg. He was on CNN with Jake Tapper. Tapper pushed him on these issues. And Buttigieg himself was deeply condescending towards Trump voters, essentially saying that that you're excusing racism if you vote for Donald Trump. They're leaving you no room to vote for Donald Trump. If you vote for Donald Trump, you're supporting racism. Because they want you to stay home or they want you to vote for them. They really want you to vote for them. This is where the Democrats' vote suppression efforts are going in 2020. They're working very hard to try to suppress conservatives from voting for the president in the name of race and racism. If you support the president, you're a bad person. If you support the president, you're supporting a bad person. If you support the president, you're a racist supporting racist policies. Even if the reason you're supporting the president is because you look at the left and you say, these people are trying to destroy my faith. They're trying to destroy my Christian-run business. They're trying to destroy my values. They're trying to do abortion on demand. They're trying to wreck the economy. They're trying to go full socialist. If you stand up against that, you're a racist. That's the way they want to have it. And that's why the New York Times 1619 Project is so important to the left, is because they're trying to help set the parameters for the 2020 debate by saying you're either with them or you're with racists. That's what they're doing, and I suspect they're going to see some blowback.
As both sides target Georgia for 2020, Erick gives you the news you need from a Georgia perspective.
Transportation has since April 2017 been going into rural Georgia. In Ben Hill, Coweta is not really rural, that's Noonan. Crawford, Elbert, Grady, Greene, Harris, Hart, Jackson, Lawrence, Meriwether, Morgan, Pike, Stevens, Telfair, Tift, Trutland, Walton, Ware, Wayne, Wheeler, and Wilkes counties. 24 bridges. Some of the replaced bridges were closed or had weight restrictions. The new bridges can accommodate school buses, emergency vehicles, farm trucks, and other vehicles. Now, you'll recall there was a tax increase. It was a 2015 law. It raised the gas tax in Georgia for road and bridge construction. Small portion set aside to replace local bridges off the state highway system. That's what they needed to get it through the legislature, despite it being a tax increase. And what it actually was, if we're fair about it, is they replaced how Georgia's tax on gas was valued. It had been fixed, and they now let it go up and down with pricing, with the gas price. So it yes, it was a tax increase, but it was really just a revaluation of how they value the sales tax for gasoline in Georgia. And the money, of course, to get it through the legislature, they needed to convince rural Georgian legislators to vote for it. So they took bridges that are in local systems, not the state system, and fixed those 24 bridges. Again, the counties that have seen this money come in and fix bridges: Atkinson, Bacon, Ben Hill, Coweta, Crawford, Elbert, Grady, Greene, Harris, Hart, Jackson, Lawrence, Meriwether, Morgan, Pike, Stevens, Telfair, Tift, Trutland, Walton, Ware, Wayne, Wheeler, and Wilkes. And listen, I apologize if I mispronounced your county. You would be amazed at the anger that is generated by mispronouncing Coweta. For example, Noonan. I was actually running a congressional campaign for a candidate in Coweta County, and he referred to it as Coweta. And you would think he had said that Jesus and the devil were brothers. I mean, they wanted to crucify him. Coweta, not Coweta. Coweta. Same with Trutland County. Truetland. No, it's not Truetland County. It's Trutland County. I learned this moving over to Georgia because, I'm a native of Louisiana. I moved over here to go to Mercer in the 90s. I stayed, met my wife, settled down in Georgia, and we live north of Houston County, but it's Houston County here. And her family is from not Vienna, but from Vienna. And we're looking at a radio station for this program down along the state line with Florida in Cairo, not Cairo. It just it never ceases to boggle my mind, the pronunciations in the state of Georgia. But nonetheless, you get road improvements in Georgia. We're also seeing more people complaining about the new voting systems. This from the AJC. A petition signed by more than 1,450 voters asked Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger on Monday to redo his quote-unquote deficient certification of Georgia's new voting system, saying the original examination failed to test for security, voter registration integration, and ballot verifiability. Georgia law allows any 10 or more voters to request a reexamination at any time if they pay reasonable costs. The petition asks for costs to be waived, of course. Oh, my goodness. So here's what we have. Democrats want to go back to paper ballots like we had before the 2000 election in Georgia, where it's Scantron sheets, you fill in the bubble. Remember, the whole reason we went to electronic balloting is because Democratic voters in Palm Beach County, Florida, were too stupid to figure out their ballot. And the whole nation had to be upended, and everybody wanted to go to electronic balloting. You know who didn't want to go to electronic balloting? Conservatives didn't actually want to go to electronic balloting. We wanted paper balloting. Well, now we've been here for a while, and guess what we figured out? Handicapped voters and older voters are the largest pool of voters. They like the touch screen for visibility. It's easier for them to see. If they have arthritis, they don't have to fill out the little bubble with the pen. It's useful for older voters to have the touch screen. But what's going on here is, led by this Stacey Abrams effort and others, Democrats really want the mythology to become reality, the idea that the vote is being stolen in Georgia. And so with electronic voting machines, they want to cast doubts. They want to presume they can be hacked. They have no data to back this up. They have none of that. And yet this is what they're doing. They want to amplify these concerns, and they're not going to go anywhere. When we come back, are Trump voters going to sit home in next year? Let's discuss it. Hello and welcome. The third hour of the Erick Erickson Show is here. I just so happen to be Erick Erickson, and if you would like to talk to me, you can pick up the phone and call 877-97-ERIC. That's 877-973-7425. You can also get me on social media, Twitter, EW Erickson, same for Facebook and for Instagram and for YouTube. I'm actually streaming the show live on YouTube and Twitter right now. You know, Facebook won't let you stream live on Facebook and other devices. I wish they would. They need to reconsider that. Nonetheless, YouTube and Twitter today is where I'm live streaming, and you can call in the program as well. I want to, let me kick off with this story to get to where I want to go, so you have a sense of it. This is from ABC News. An Ohio man has been arrested for making threats toward a local Jewish community center in the Mahoning County Jail on $250,000 bond with a court hearing this morning. On Friday, the FBI Violent Crimes Task Force raided Reardon's home and seized a cache of weapons and ammunition, including dozens of rounds of ammo, multiple semi-automatic weapons, a gas mask, and bulletproof armor. The Anti-Defamation League in Cleveland tweeted, "Grateful for the work of the FBI, local law enforcement, and our community partners in the Youngstown Jewish community. We will continue to employ all our resources to stop the spread of white nationalism and violent extremism." Police became aware of Reardon on July 11th. He posted a video on Instagram of a man shooting a semi-automatic rifle with sirens and screams in the background, and he tagged the Jewish Community Center of Youngstown in the post. He's an avowed anti-Semite and a white nationalist. He attended the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. During the raid at his house on Friday, police discovered anti-Semitic and white nationalist propaganda. Extra security was given to the community during the police investigation, which will remain at large. Now, two other people as well have been detained for plotting violence in the country, domestic terrorism, if you will. And then you had the situation in Portland, Oregon this weekend where you had the Antifa, anti-fascists, and the supposed fascists battling it out in the streets. The white nationalists were in small numbers, and Antifa beating the crap out of everybody. The mayor of Portland, Oregon, praising Antifa there, and Antifa is essentially a terrorist organization as well. You know, the anti-fascists and the fascists are essentially kissing cousins. The fascists and the communists, and Antifa is anarchist communists. They're two sides of the same coin. Andy No, who was beaten up by Antifa a few weeks ago, was on Fox News with my buddy Griff Jenkins talking about this. Here's some of what Andy said about Portland.
Political violence is routine in Portland now. Yesterday was no exception. There was a lot of fear of there being massive bloodshed, and in the end, nobody was killed. And apparently here, that means it was a success. But what happened was that people were maced and beaten on the streets. You had masses of demonstrators come out to confront. Some of them confront physically a much smaller group of right-wing protesters, and in the footage that you're playing, how they targeted people were, once they were separated from the group, for example, walking to their cars, they would mob them, and some of them had weapons.
You see, Gabriel, in the video we were playing, that's a hammer breaking the glass. The mayor out in Portland, Mayor Ted Wheeler, calling it a largely peaceful event. It looks like anything but, Gabriel.
Gabriel was the other guy that Griff was talking to. So we do have a rise of white nationalism in this country in the last few years. White nationalists have felt emboldened to come out of the shadows, and the media, of course, blames the president. I actually think that the president is not the person to blame for this. I think what is happening now, of course, the media is loath to discuss this, but what you have are now, with the rise of internet forums, Reddit, 8chan, 4chan, Twitter, and the like, You have more and more people in private groups on the internet who are talking to each other and building community with each other, and they want their communities to come out of the shadows. And the president, if anything, is a symptom of a larger problem in the United States that also relates to this. It is a breakdown in local community. It's a breakdown in national community. It's a breakdown in national confidence and conversation. And it is both sides mad at each other. And the president's election, in large part, was a lot of people who felt like both political parties in Washington had completely ignored them. And so they hijacked one party and put the president in power to fight them both, somewhat successfully in so doing. And the media has badly misread this because the media has deep biases against conservatives to begin with, and also against the Republican Party in general, and against people who live in the heartland and blue-collar voters. They don't relate to them. They don't know them. They don't have anything in common with them. They are the other. Where I'm heading with this is, with all of this, and now this new tactic from the left and from the Democratic Party, that if you're not with them, you're for the racists. If you're not with them, you're bad. If you're for Donald Trump, you're propping up a racist authoritarian regime. The reason I bring all of this up, and now the rise of these white supremacist shooters around the country, I was talking to a buddy of mine the other day. And I didn't vote for the president in 2016. I'm voting for him in 2020. I didn't vote for him in 2016. It was rather public. I still think character counts. And I didn't think either he or Hillary Clinton really had the character to warrant my vote for president. And so I wasn't going to vote for him. And I have come to terms with the fact that 80, 90, 100 million Americans didn't think character mattered. They just wanted their side or the other, and I'm not going to sit it out this time, and I'm not going to vote third party. I voted third party last time, and that guy turned out to be a raging buffoon. So I'll vote for the president. When I look at the Democrats and the insanity in the Democratic Party and the rise of socialism there, the rise of awful rhetoric against their fellow Americans, I'm definitely going to vote for the president. I've still got issues with the president. He knows it. He and I have discussed it. We've had several private conversations that I don't need to get into, but he knows I'm going to vote for him in 2020. But so I'm talking to my friend the other day who voted for the president in 2016, and he's not going to vote in 2020, he doesn't think. He's not going to vote in 2020 because he doesn't think anything has changed. He doesn't think the president really has shaken up the system. He thinks the president's been co-opted by the system. But more than that, he thinks that the president has, and the Democrats alike, and he blames them both, but they've exacerbated tensions in this country. And that he doesn't now want to be in a situation. In 2016, he didn't care for the president, but he really hated Hillary Clinton. And now he sees a situation where he doesn't really like anybody. He feels like the president never became president. He stayed Donald Trump on the campaign trail, and he wanted something else. I guess he wanted George W. Bush or something. When you get into office, you rise to the occasion, and he doesn't see the president rising to the occasion. And he looks at the Democrats, and he sees people who want to harm his way of life. He's a Christian. He's committed to his faith. He runs his business on Christian principles, and he sees the Democrats wanting to destroy his business because of that. So he didn't want to vote for them. So he seems very disaffected. And I don't know that the polling reflects this. I don't know that the polling can capture the dissatisfaction. I do know, though, that some of the polling out there should worry the president. Jamie Dupree, who writes for Cox Media Group and the Cox Washington Bureau, he's got this about the Fox News polling. As President Trump returned to the White House following a summer break at his golf course in New Jersey, the president teed off on Fox News, expressing aggravation against the Fox News polls that have showed him trailing some of the top Democrats running for president. My worst polls have always been from Fox, the president told reporters. There's something going on at Fox, I'll tell you right now. Fox is a lot different than it used to be, Mr. Trump added, taking aim at their news division, but not the stable of conservative talk show hosts who have stood by him over the last 3 years. Asked about the most recent poll from Fox News, which showed him trailing the top tier of 2020 candidates for president, he was succinct. I don't believe it. And then he had a series of tweets. Great cohesion inside the Republican Party, the best I've ever seen, despite all the Fox News. My poll numbers are great. New internal polls show them to be the strongest we've had so far. Think what they'd be if I got fair media coverage. Fox News is at it again, so different from what they used to be during the 2016 primaries and before Proud Warriors. Now, new Fox polls, which have always been terrible to me, they had me losing big to Crooked Hillary, have me down to Sleepy Joe, even considering. Despite all the fake news, my poll numbers are great, the president tweeted. Fox News says best economy in decades, the president tweeted in July, and on it goes. I think the president and Republicans have some problems. I think they can overcome these problems. This is not doom and gloom. I also think the pollsters do still need to be careful about weighing too heavily people from the coast, from New York, from California. Remember, Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, but she largely won the popular vote because of New York and California. You subtract that out. Subtract out California itself, she lost the popular vote. So that can skew the polls, but there are definitely room for Republicans to be worried. But I'm concerned that there's something the polls can't measure. The number of people who are frankly just burnt out on American politics, who are burnt out on both sides going after each other, who are burnt out on the idea that if they support the president, they're a terrible person. They're burnt out on the idea that the president constantly fights and never tries to heal the country. And I'm picking this up not just from this friend I was talking to this weekend, but from more people, that there is something out there happening to a lot of people who would classify themselves as evangelicals, but they're not their parents' evangelicals, that they're willing to refrain from politics. They really do believe in a church and state separation, and they don't want to engage in it. And some of these people voted for the president in 2016. Now, I know other people who didn't vote for the president in 2016, myself included, who are going to vote for him in 2020. So I don't know how it balances out, but I am worried about the picture and what do the president's polls and other polls paint, and is it giving an accurate picture of the lay of the land for 2020? I have no idea. I'm throwing out there, but I don't know the answer to it. I'm suggesting someone should look and see, and I don't know that I see any polling data out there to suggest that anyone has an accurate picture of the number of people who are just more and more inclined to stay home. Remember, the president only won in 2016 with 70,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. All three of those states went heavily Democrat in 2018. There's something going on out there. And I think it could be troubling for the president, and his campaign needs to figure out what it is. There are some spiritual problems, I think, happening in the country as well, some morale problems happening in the country, and people are tired of all the fighting. I think people are worn out on every single day. It seems you gotta stand on your side and prepare to fight the other side. And people are, particularly on the right, the left has taken religion and co-opted it into politics. The secular religion. People on the right, by and large, are still churchgoers, and they still have a faith-based worldview. By the way, there's some new data out that shows the rise of the nuns almost directly corresponds to the collapse in mainline denominations like the PCUSA, the Episcopalian Church, and the United Methodists, and some of the United Church of Christ and whatnot, the Evangelical Lutherans, that as they've declined, the nuns have gone up. It's like the children are learning from church that church doesn't really matter, and they're becoming the nuns. Meanwhile, within evangelicalism, Bible-believing, Bible-practicing Orthodox Christianity, the data suggests that they're not actually losing young people. That's just contrary to what you hear in the media. But what I do think is happening, what I do think the data is showing, that a lot of these younger evangelicals who were perturbed by their presidents backing a guy who bragged about his affairs with porn stars, is that they're turning off from politics. This buddy of mine I was talking to the other day, we both kind of agreed it would be a little bit humorous, a little bit funny if young evangelicals had to spend a lot of time wandering in the wilderness for the sins of their parents when it came to politics. I just don't know that there are good metrics out there for how many evangelicals in particular who they like the president, they voted for the president, but they're really tired of everything that's happening. And they've decided at this point, a pox on both their houses, they're sitting out. There is time. Don't be mad at me for saying this. There's time for the Republicans to figure this out. I think this is a real phenomenon. I keep having these conversations with people. Anecdote is not data, but when you have enough anecdotes, they begin to become data. And I'm telling you that The GOP needs to get some metrics on the people who may sit it out in 2020 and figure out what they can do. They didn't sit it out in 2016. See what they can do to bring them back. Don't just take for granted they'll come back. Find ways to get them to come back.
As both sides target Georgia for 2020, Erick gives you the news you need from a Georgia perspective.
Well, there is, speaking of the drama and people getting burnt out on politics, the president is on Twitter. Anthony Scaramucci is a highly unstable nut job who was with other candidates in the primary who got shellacked and then unfortunately wheeled his way into my campaign. I barely knew him until his 11 days of gross incompetence, made a fool of himself, bad on TV, abused staff, got fired, wrote a very nice book about me just recently. Now the book is a lie. Said his wife was driving him crazy. Something big was happening with her, getting divorced. He was a mental wreck. We didn't want him around. Now fake news puts him on like he was my buddy. There is the president of the United States taking time out of his busy schedule to blast Anthony Scaramucci. And it is a lot of drama. It is, if we're honest. It's a lot of drama. Although I gotta say, Scaramucci doesn't strike me as a super bright guy, politically at least. And he and Bill Kristol apparently floating some sort of plan and to get the president, have somebody challenge the president, Scaramucci saying the president's not going to run for re-election. Here's the thing. This is like the 25th Amendment. If you recall, after the president got elected, there were constantly rumors that, the cabinet's going to get together and launch the 25th Amendment. They're going to remove the president, which if you actually read the 25th Amendment, it's impossible to do. And yet they were essentially offing this as some level of coup with cabinet officers. They're going to get Mike Pence in there with these cabinet officers, and they're going to make it happen. If you read the 25th Amendment, it's totally impossible for that to happen based on the wording of the amendment. Let me pull it up real quick and read this for you. In case of removal of the president from office, the powers of the office devolve to the vice president. And then, whenever the vice president, this is section 4, whenever the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments, that would be the cabinet, or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the vice president shall immediately assume the powers as acting president. Thereafter, when the president transmits to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that no inability exists, he shall resume the powers and duties unless the vice president and a majority of the cabinet transmit within 4 days their written declaration the president is unable to discharge the duties and powers of his office. Thereupon, Congress shall decide the issue, assembling within 48 hours for that purpose, if not in session. If the Congress, within 21 days after receipt of the latter declaration from the Vice President and Cabinet, or not in session within 21 days after Congress is required to assemble, determines by 2/3 votes of both houses the President's unable to discharge his duties, the Vice President will continue to be acting President. Otherwise, the President will resign. So what's at stake here? You deploy the 25th Amendment. You have to have the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet tell Congress the president's unfit. Then all the president has to do is say, they're lying, I am fit. And then within 4 days, the vice president and majority of the cabinet have to say, no, it's us. He is unfit. And then Congress has to come back in session, and they have 21 days to decide whether or not the president is fit for office. And then it takes a 2/3 vote. Just like with impeachment, it takes a 2/3 vote to remove him. In fact, it's a higher bar than impeachment, because impeachment only needs a majority vote in the House of Representatives. So the media and progressive activists who for a long time were floating this mythology of the 25th Amendment, that something was going to happen, they're now floating this, they're going to push the president off the ballot. A Republican's going to run against the president and kick him off the ballot. The president's going to decide he made America great again and he's going to go home. You know, for a while, there actually were some rumors the president would say, I've done everything I needed to do. The economy's growing again. Wages are up. Jobs are good. Unemployment's down for everyone. I've made America great again. I'm going home. That rumor was actually circulating even among people in the White House. But he's not doing it. And the more people like Scaramucci and Bill Kristol and others, and I very much like Bill Kristol a lot, but I disagree with him on this. The more they come out and say, there's a plot afoot, the president's not going to run again, we're going to have somebody run against the president, that just means the president's going to double down. And in doubling down, he's not going anywhere. And no one can make him go anywhere short of the voters. And now, of course, what you're going to see is that this madness on the left saying, this just means that he's not going to leave the White House. This just means that the president of the United States, he's not going to get out of there. He's going to cling on. We're going to have to forcibly evict him. No, it's not the way the Constitution works. On noon on January 20th, 2021, a new president will be sworn in. He will be the president. If the old president's still in the White House, he gets evicted. It's that simple. Hello there, it is Erick Erickson. My apologies to those of you who wanted to call in today. As I was saying earlier, so our call screener is working from a remote studio, and a drunk driver took out the transformer at a Chick-fil-A down the street from where they were. It took out power to their whole area. So have not been able to get the call screening up this entire show. So it's been me talking. You've been listening. I've interacted with some of you on social media, Twitter and YouTube. We'll go back to Facebook Live tomorrow. So don't worry about phones. I do want to tell you that the show is sponsored today by First Liberty Georgia, First Liberty Building and Loan. If you are a small or medium-sized business, you know it can sometimes be a pain in the butt to go through a bank bureaucracy to try to get a loan. The paperwork, the anonymity of the people reviewing it, you don't have a relationship with them. My friend Brant Frost, he and his family own First Liberty Building and Loan over in Noonan. And they are a small business, medium-sized business lender. If you got a small business or a medium-sized business and you need access to capital, you need a loan, you want to grow your business, go to First Liberty Georgia, firstlibertyga.com. Talk to my buddy Brant Frost. Tell him I sent you. It is a great way to support this show. They were hugely instrumental in helping me get the show off the ground. And they're dear friends of mine. And I am very happy to recommend them. They're just good people. So if you got a small or medium-sized business, you're thinking you need access to a loan, interest rates have gone down, now's the time to do it. Go to firstlibertyga.com and talk to the Frost family. And they are way better to deal with than some massive bank conglomerate somewhere. Which reminds me, can I just... This Truist thing still bugs me. SunTrust and BB&T are merging. And instead of using one of the two dependable brands, like SunTrust is a very good brand. BB&T is buying them, but SunTrust has a good national brand, and they would save money if they just left it. Instead, they're going to go with this made-up word, Truist. Are they really going to change the name of the field or the park to Truist Park instead of SunTrust Park? Now, I still call it the Brave Stadium, and the reason I call it the Brave Stadium is I'm always tempted to refer to it as Turner Field. I personally think they ought to call it Hank Aaron Field at Bobby Cox Park, but they're not doing that. They want to name it after a bank, and it's just so dumb. It is such a dumb name, and you can tell they paid a lot of money to some sort of hipster creative ad agency to come up with a name, and they came up with Truist. Truthiest, whatever it is. It's ridiculous. Okay, Sam Stein writing at the Daily Beast. Democrats want to turn Trump's Twitter addiction into an election issue. I read you the Scaramucci tweet. This is happening now. The party recently commissioned polling that showed framing the president as ineffective because of his social media habits is one of its most persuasive arguments. Full stop. The subtitle, let me read you the subtitle again. The party recently commissioned polling that showed framing the president as ineffective because of his tweets is one of its most persuasive arguments. Does anyone really believe that? This seems to be people in a bubble. One of the party's top one of the party's top think tanks, say that 5 times fast. One of the party's top think tanks has been privately encouraging lawmakers and candidates to attack the president for failing to deliver on the promises he made because he's too consumed by social media. It is undoubtedly the first case of a campaign tactic geared towards turning a president's online behavior into a liability, though rarely has a president's reliance on or use of a media bullhorn been such a defining personality trait. Those pushing it have offered new polling data to bolster the idea, and the argument will move voters. Oh, of course, it's Center for American Progress Action Fund. That's it. They commissioned the firm Civis to test messaging that framed Trump not as corrupt or unethical, but as ineffective, and to attribute that ineffectiveness to his being absorbed by his Twitter feed. The results were notable. Of the 6 messages tested on Trump, the idea that he was more focused on his Twitter account than on delivering on his promises was the only one that consistently moved the vote towards Democrats, including among Obama-Trump voters. Soon after the study was commissioned, top officials in the party began pushing the line. Y'all, this just doesn't strike me as true. They're going to focus on the president's Twitter habit. It seems to be baked into the calculation at this point. I mean, I know a lot of voters who are turned off by the president's tweets, many of whom will vote for the president in 2020. But they're still turned off by it. They think it's a bad idea. I hear from Trump voters all the time who say they wish he'd stop tweeting. But that it shifts voters to the Democrats because he tweets, that it's not their issues that resonate. It's not antipathy for the president that resonates. It's not voters worry about the economy that resonate. It's not their view of policy that resonates. It's that the president tweets. That's what's going to do it for the Democrats. That doesn't strike me as true. It sounds like somebody at a think tank came up with a good idea, at least they thought it was. They needed to justify it, so they commissioned polling and made sure the polling would go the way they wanted it. That's what that sounds like. Very weird. Meanwhile, I think that the economy continues to be an issue that the president's going to have to worry about. Here is Phil Rucker on MSNBC about the president and the economy.
Interesting what he had to say about the economy, which was basically, you've got to vote for me because the economy is strong right now. But privately, our reporting has been that he's quite alarmed and rattled about some of these negative indicators that we've seen this week and over the past couple of weeks, as well as what's happening abroad with some of these foreign countries, foreign economies. And Trump is calling out to CEOs, to friends, to some of his real estate buddies, trying to take their temperature and also voicing skepticism about some of the data that he's seeing, saying some of these statistics are not to be believed because they're cooked up by economists who have an anti-Trump bias. So we'll see how this plays out, but it's not a particularly good sign, I think, for some of his advisors.
Yeah, you know, there's some reporting out that some of Trump's advisors are not telling him the truth about the economic numbers. They're skewing them to make it sound better. Peter Navarro, I'm sure Peter Navarro is the guy who got us into the trade war to begin with, convinced the president to do it. He's telling the president everything is hunky-dory, A-OK. The president, also on this issue, a deal with China. Seems like he's not ready for one. Here's the president talking to reporters.
Well, I'd be prepared for it. We can do a lot of things, but if it slowed down, it would be because I have to take on China and some other countries. Look, you have other countries that are just as bad as China the way they treat us. You take a look at what's happening with the European Union. They have barriers, they have tariffs. Take a look at I'm not going to mention all the countries because you'll be surprised, but we're treated very badly. A lot of them by our allies. We're treated very badly. When all of that normalizes, we've got a rocket ship. Our country is going to be stronger by far than ever before. I mean, if I wanted to make a bad deal and settle on China, the market would go up, but it wouldn't be the right thing to do. I'm just not ready to make a deal yet. China would like to make a deal. I'm not ready.
We'll see how that shakes out. Meanwhile, Larry Kudlow, his top economic advisor, telling people there is no recession on the horizon. He was on Meet the Press this weekend with Chuck Todd saying there's no recession on the horizon. Chuck Todd pointed out that in 2007, right before the Great Recession, Larry Kudlow was saying there was no recession on the horizon. Peggy Noonan, who I have always loved Peggy Noonan. I love being on TV with Peggy Noonan. We're on Meet the Press panels occasionally together. Really like Peggy Noonan. Here's her on this.
I think in a merely political sense, if the economy turns down, the 2020 presidential election will become even more brutal, more ugly, more about other primal, rather.
No, I want to get to that after this because I think that's exactly what we saw a little bit this week.
I noticed what Carol said. 3 times Larry Kudlow said, let's not be afraid of optimism. He kept slamming away at that. He wanted that to be your takeaway. That makes me nervous. That sounds like a thing we've decided we're putting out there. It sounds like prosperity is just around the corner. It sounds like one of those hollow things that they want out there in a headline. Boy, it's just looking a little unsteady, I think, economically. Perhaps people are having less confidence than they've had in the past 2 years.
It does make you wonder. It really does make you wonder, are the president's advisors giving him an accurate picture of what's going on? I know from people inside the White House that the president does have some advisors who try to withhold bad news from him. They're afraid of getting the blame. We do see people in this White House who are more interested in having the relationship with the president than giving the president the truth in case he gets mad at them. And you should be worried if you're a Republican. Look, if the economy does go south, and there have been a number of warning signs, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. My buddy Chris Burns from Dynamic Money was here last week talking about this, that we have had these situations in the past where we've had an inverted yield curve, which typically happens. It's happened before every recession in the last 50 years, but the inverted yield curve has happened at times where we did not then have a recession. So we may not have one. Janet Yellen, the former head of the Federal Reserve, saying we should be cautious, we should be concerned, but probably not going to have one. The president himself says we have the strongest economy out there, and he's actually right on that. We do have the strongest economy out there right now in the world. The United States, and this is to Janet Yellen's point, former head of the Federal Reserve, that in fact we are in a situation where we have greater stability in our economy than other places. Other places are on economic hard times. Other places do have concerns with the economy, and we don't necessarily have that here in this country. So we have a little more cushion. Here's Janet Yellen from the other day. She was on CNBC talking about this. Again, former head of the Federal Reserve. She was replaced by Jerome Powell, the current head, Donald Trump appointee. Yellen had been appointed by Barack Obama.
Are we going into a recession?
So I think the answer is most likely no. I think that the U.S. economy has enough strength to avoid that. But the odds have clearly risen, and they're higher than I'm frankly comfortable with.
Yeah, the odds are higher than people are comfortable with it, but she doesn't think it's going to happen. So, I mean, what picture is the president getting? I really do think the economy is going to make or break the Trump presidency. It sounds trite to say. Everybody says it. You don't have to be a genius to think this. People vote with their pocketbooks, and the president is going into culture war mode to try to keep people on board, and I don't know that that's going to work so much. And the reason I don't think that it's going to work is because ultimately suburban voters, the voters the president needs to hold on to, voters he was able to pick up in 2016 and might have lost some of in 2018, they're not culture warriors. If Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee, he's going to have a real hard time holding on to these voters if the economy goes south because they're pocketbook voters. And they'll let the president do a lot on life issues. They'll let the president stack the Supreme Court and federal court system with a bunch of conservatives. They don't care about gay marriage. They're okay with it. They're okay with it not being so. That they don't care about these issues. They care about their 401k. They care about their kids' futures. And you start messing with their retirement, they're going to have a world of hurt. You start messing with their retirement, and they're going to be very angry with you. And so if the economy shifts negatively, they're going to blame the president, and the president's not going to win re-election. So it is in his best interest right now for his advisors to give him the most candid, frank advice on what we can do to stave off a recession. But you know the irony here. It's in the Democrats' best interest. If Congress has to be involved in the equation, it's in the Democrats' best interest to make sure the president can't do what needs to be done because they benefit from an economic downturn.
Erick Erickson wades through the fake news to give you the real news.
The truth you demand.
It's honest news and conservative views.
It is Erick Erickson here, the Erick Erickson Show. Phone lines, we finally have power, but it's almost out of time. So we'll take your phone calls tomorrow because I'll be back here tomorrow. I want to remind you again, the show is brought to you by First Liberty Building and Loan, First Liberty, Georgia. You can go to their website, firstlibertyga.com. If you need a small business, medium-sized business loan, you don't want to deal with a big bank bureaucracy, go see Brant Frost. Tell him I sent you. He will work with you. FirstLibertyGA.com is their website. Now, other news out there. Guns, guns, guns. We're continuing to have more on guns. Here's Bakari Sellers on CNN. I want to play this whole audio for you because he gets to something I've been saying as to why there's probably not going to be a lot of progress. And by the way, if the president can deliver some sort of progress on it, it could shift his polling positively for some voters if he threads the needle carefully without hurting himself with Second Amendment voters. Listen to this.
But back during Sandy Hook, when there were 20-plus young white kids who lost their lives in a school shooting, and the United States Congress did absolutely nothing, I'm under no illusion that we're going to have any gun control or any laws change that can make it more difficult for people who do not need to have weapons to purchase them. So this has been a problem long before Donald Trump. I don't actually think this rests at his feet. I know he's the president of the United States now, but I think that lack of courage that Andrew's been talking about, that fecklessness that we're all talking about, has been a part of the Republican Party because they've been purchased by the NRA for a very long period of time. And if they didn't do anything after Sandy Hook, I'm of no belief that they're going to do anything now. And secondly, I'm about 5 miles away from Mother Emanuel AME Church this morning, right here in Charleston, South Carolina. And the Senate chair, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Lindsey Graham, represents this area. He represents this state. And we still have the Charleston loophole whereby Dylan Roof was able to walk in, and because his background checks were not completed in the amount of time period by the FBI, he was able to purchase that weapon, go in and kill 9 people at a Bible study. And if the chair of the Judiciary Committee represents this area and he still will not do anything, I'm of no belief any of them will. So while we want to beat up on Donald Trump a lot, let me just say that his cowardice is not his alone.
So, yeah, there's an attack on the Republican Party there. Standard Democratic talking points on this stuff. That's true. That is the reality. But what I think is worth noting is there is a realization sinking in that probably nothing is going to change. If the president and the Republicans in Congress are able to fund more background checks and fix the database problems that the country has seen, I think that is probably progress in the right direction. Again, the president saying that it is a mental health issue. We need to figure out how to deal with the mental health issue. Frankly, I got to tell you guys, there's something to be said for re-incentivizing institutionalization. Back during the late 70s and the early 80s, a movement sprung up in this country to allow people out of mental care facilities, institutions run by states, and put them back in the population. And many of those places shut down. You know, we've got one here in Milledgeville. And my mother-in-law was talking this weekend to me about a lady who they work at a soup kitchen. And this lady came in and she needs her son to be somewhere. The son is a danger to her. He has mental health issues. He cannot hold a job. She is elderly. He is abusive. She doesn't want to arrest. She doesn't want him thrown in jail. He just needs help. It's help she can't get him. He needs to be in an institution somewhere. She can't send him to the men's homeless shelter because you have to go look for a job during the day and certify that you've been looking for a job. He's not fit to do that. Where do you take someone like that? You used to be able to leave them in a place like in Milledgeville, in a state institution for mental care, and now you can't. We had that where I grew up in Louisiana. We literally were across the creek from the state mental health institution east. It was like the Milledgeville of Louisiana. And they started letting people out into the community in the late 70s, early 80s. It deteriorated the quality of life for a lot of people. And a lot of families have nowhere to go. When you have a child who is mentally unwell, you are elderly, you are in the house with him, and he's beating you, it is a cruel thing to know you've got to file charges against your son and throw him in jail when the reality is that he is mentally unwell and needs to be somewhere committed, institutionalized, where he can be taken care of. And we as a society have decided that it is more compassionate to not do that. And in many cases, that's wrong. And this is an issue I think the president needs to address. Frankly, I think this is an issue the president could talk up and champion, the reinstitutionalization of a lot of people who don't need to be out on the streets. Now, of course, the Democrats will vilify it and demagogue it and say the president wants to round up everyone and put them in institutions. But frankly, there are some people who need to be in institutions, some people who are completely unwell, whose parents don't want them to have to go to jail because the situation is going to be exacerbated. They're not going to be able to stay in there and get the treatment they need. We as a society need to figure out what to do with these people. If we really want to address the issue of mental health and we really want to address the young men who are deranged, who are going out and shooting or beating up people or abusing the elderly, I think we're going to have to look at this, unfortunately. One more thing before we get out of here. The president has been asked more about Hong Kong and is amping up his rhetoric in defense of the Hong Kong protesters now that he has a better sense of who these people are. I want to play this clip for you from the president talking to the press about Hong Kong.
Well, I can speak to him anytime, but he understands how I feel. I just can't comment as to whether or not I spoke to him. But I will tell you this. We're having very, very substantive talks with China and with others, but with China. I can't believe it. You know, I tell you, I've never seen 2 million people. When you talk about crowd size, Maggie, those are serious crowds, the Hong Kong crowds. I mean, that when they said 2 million people on the streets, that really looked like 2 million people on the street. No, I think it would be very hard to deal if they do violence. I mean, if it's another Tiananmen Square, I think it's a very hard thing to do if there's violence. And, you know, that I'm president, but that's a little beyond me because I think there'd be tremendous political sentiment not to do something. So I hope, because I think we're going to end up doing a very good deal. And I think China, by the way, needs a deal much more than we do. But I really do believe that if this weren't part of the deal, possibly something would have happened already a long time ago.
This situation in Hong Kong could be the destabilizing force in the economy. And if the president were to make sure that happened, maybe he neutralizes himself from an economic downturn. Talk to y'all tomorrow.